Many of us are familiar with the story of the disciple Thomas. We tend to think of him as doubting Thomas. I think a lot of Christians give Thomas a bad rap. We tend to think of doubt as the opposite of faith and is therefore sinful and wrong. But is doubt simply an example of faith's wimpy opposite? Or is it a sign of a faith that is alive, vibrant, and in real relationship with God? Let's take a closer look at the story of Thomas today to see if that really is what the scripture teaches, or is there more to the story? Many times throughout the Gospels, Jesus taught his disciples and friends what would happen to him. In Luke 9:22, Jesus said, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And he must be killed on the third day, and on the third day be raised to life." Jesus' followers had witnessed his betrayal, crucifixion, and death, but they didn't comprehend the resurrection yet. You have an outline in your bulletin. I would invite you to follow along with that. We have some fill in the blanks. The first person to see Jesus was Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene was the first to encounter Jesus at the tomb. She sees him, but she doesn't recognize him. In John chapter 20, Mary has gone to the tomb and finds the tomb open and the body gone. And as she is despairing, a man speaks to her. We'll pick it up at verse 15. Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. So in this passage, we see that Mary Magdalene did not believe at first. She didn't recognize Jesus until she heard his voice. Now, it doesn't specifically say it, but you may get the sense that she also wanted to touch him or hug him, because Jesus says, "Don't touch me yet. I haven't ascended yet." Later on, we'll see that Jesus will invite his friends to touch him, but not yet. Second passage we're going to look at is the story of the two guys on the road to Emmaus. This is Luke 24:13 through 35, and I'm going to summarize part of it. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And Jesus joins them, but they don't recognize him. And he asks them what they've been talking about. About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. But we had hoped. Sounds like doubt to me. And what is more, it's the third day since all this took place. Some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning but didn't find his body. They came and told us they saw a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it as the women said, but didn't see Jesus. He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe in all the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures about himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he was going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Oh, stay with us, for it's nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. Next verse in this passage is our memory verse. Would you read this with me? This is Luke 24:32. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together, and they were saying, "It is true, the Lord is risen and has appeared to Simon." Then these two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Now, there's several details we can pull out of this story that's really interesting. These two men, one named Cleopas, are followers of Jesus, but they are not two of the disciples. We know that because they're reported back to the remaining 11 disciples. They are walking down. They're walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Jerusalem to Emmaus is a downhill road, and that's going to pop up a second later. The road is 7 miles long. Now, I clocked it. 7 miles is like walking from here at Penn Ave in Pine City all the way out to the Miracle Mile where the golf course is, the entrance to the golf course. That's 7 miles. That's a long walk. That's several hours. These two guys spend the entire time talking and listening to this stranger and never recognize him. And it isn't until Jesus takes some bread, lifts it, and shares it with these men that the light bulb goes on. Why then? What did they see? When he lifted that bread, I think they saw the nail prints on his hands. They saw the scars that he bore. The only person who could be bearing those nail scars and still be alive was Jesus. Now these guys immediately returned to Jerusalem. Some translations say they ran uphill. Remember, it was downhill going down to Emmaus. Now they're running uphill with tremendous excitement and energy to see the disciples and tell them what they saw. All right, the third scripture we're going to look at is where Jesus appears to the disciples. This is Luke 24:36-46. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your mind? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they still did not believe, because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. And he said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that was written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Then he opened their minds so they can understand the scriptures. The disciples certainly doubted initially. They thought they saw a ghost. They still didn't believe when they saw the scars on his hands and feet. Now, Jesus is presenting his scars to them, unlike what he did with Mary Magdalene. Typical guys, I'll believe it when it involves food. He had to eat something in front of them first. But then in verse 44, Jesus patiently opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. Okay, now, the Gospel of John tells us that Thomas wasn't there for this appearance. John 20, 24 through 29, we see that Jesus appears to Thomas. Okay? John says, "Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand in his side, I will not believe.'" Now, Thomas is not saying anything extraordinary here. He's doing the exact same thing as the rest of the disciples. John 20, 26 through 29. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Now, notice that the gospel does not say that Thomas actually touched Jesus. He simply declares in one of the most powerful statements of faith ever written, "My Lord and my God." I was taught as a very young child in Sunday school that Thomas was the doubter. And there's something wrong with Thomas because he would not believe until he actually saw and touched Jesus physically. We are blessed today when we don't see tangible evidence and still believe. But we have a couple thousand years worth of history to work with us too. But everyone in these passages we just looked at failed to recognize Jesus also. Mary Magdalene, the Emmaus Walk guys, the disciples, Thomas, none of them recognized or believed until they physically saw Jesus and saw the scars. But for some strange reason, only poor Thomas gets labeled the doubter. And that's unfair and may miss the point. Secondly, while everyone is overwhelmed with the joy and excitement and shock of the resurrection, they seemed to have forgotten one thing: Jesus' scars. Only Thomas remembers them and asks about them. In other words, the only person at this point who remembers Jesus' whole story, all of the pain and the hope too, is Thomas. You see, redemption is more than just erasing our pain. And redemption involves the way we live in spite of the fact that we still carry scars. Thomas expects scars. If the guy standing in front of him does not have scars, Thomas knows he can't be the Jesus he knew, because the real Jesus suffered something horrible. Thomas is the only one in the room brave enough to remember that a friend's painful wounds still remain, and he asks about them. He remembers that the suffering of Jesus was real, just like our own suffering. Thomas speaks only one other time in the Bible. When Lazarus died and Mary and Martha begged Jesus to come back to them in Judea, the disciples try to talk Jesus out of it. In John 11:8, they say, "The Jews were just now trying to stone you, and you want to go back there?" But Thomas, and only Thomas in this story, pipes up and says in John 11:16, "Let us all go, that we may die with him." All the other disciples fear for Jesus' life and for their own. Thomas is willing to die alongside Jesus. It's sad that we label Thomas doubting Thomas, but we ignore the fact that he is also the willing to die with Jesus Thomas. Fill that in on your blank. He was the willing to die with Jesus Thomas. Scars. We all have them. If you ever had surgery, you have a scar. If you ever had a significant wound on your body, you have a scar. Most of the exterior healed scars are no longer painful. They're there, but they're a distant memory. The deeply wounded scars on the inside, now that's a different story. Betrayal, humiliation, rejection, lies, shame, disgrace, you name your scar. Scar sharing is the solid foundation for any authentic friendship. No one really knows us until we are brave enough to show our scars to them. The people who have put their fingers and eyes on our scars and still stick with us anyway are the people who really love us. On the cross, God placed Jesus' wounds right next to ours. For centuries, Christians have used the Latin word stigmata to describe Jesus' scars. Now, stigmata is the plural of the English word stigma. And stigma means a mark of shame or disgrace. All of our scars, even Jesus' scars, are stigmas. How many of us have been wounded by the stigma of our own sin? The label with which we have to live. Alcoholic, abuser, adulterer, liar, cheater, whatever. Even though we have repented of these, even though we have been forgiven and set free by God's grace, we still remember and carry those scars, don't we? We have all been deeply wounded by someone else. The betrayal, humiliation, rejection, lies. What do we tend to do? We tend to hide that stuff deep inside. We wear masks. We try to live our lives pretending we're something that we're not. See, in the gospel, Jesus refused to see his scars as a source of humiliation or shame or something to be hidden. He boldly invited his friends to see and touch the scars. Jesus flat out rejects the idea that we should be ashamed and secretive about terrible things that have happened to us. Jesus puts his scars right next to ours. In terms of Thomas, not only is he unafraid to ask Jesus about his scars, he's also unafraid to show them to him. Both are pretty heroic actions. Why are we so terrified of showing our scars or asking anyone about theirs? Are we missing the point of the story, which might be that scar sharing brings resurrection? Thomas is like that character in the novel Little Bee who says, "A scar is never ugly." That is what the scar makers want us to think. But you and I, we must make an agreement to defy them. We must see all scars as beauty. Because take it from me, a scar does not form on the dying. A scar means I survived. Many Christians remember Thomas as the loser who doubted. We have the opportunity to remember Thomas instead as the bold friend who refused to believe that scars were stigmas, who cared enough to ask Jesus about the scars that he survived. Let's go from here today and be like Thomas, a friend who cared. Let's go and do the same with our friends. Would you pray with me, please?